The silent visitor of the hospital. The dim glow of the hospital's fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting a sterile white hue over the nearly deserted corridors. The hum of machines, the occasional murmur of nurses on the night shift, and the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors in distant rooms were the only sounds that filled the vast, hollow space. Amira knew these sounds all too well. She crouched behind a supply cart, her tiny body barely visible in the dim corridor. Her heartbeat drummed so loudly in her ears, she was sure someone would hear it. She pressed her small hands against the cold floor, trying to steady herself as the footsteps of the night security guard echoed down the hallway. The heavy, deliberate steps sent a wave of panic through her. He was making his rounds, just like he did every night. She had memorized his routine over the past few weeks, studying him from the shadows, counting his steps, timing his movements. 3 more steps. 2 more. 1. She darted across the corridor just as he turned left, slipping behind an unattended laundry cart. She pressed her body against the wall, holding her breath. The scent of antiseptic burned her nose, but she didn't dare move. The guard hesitated for a brief second, long enough for Amira's chest to tighten with fear, before continuing down the hall. She had done it again. With silent, practiced movements, she made her way toward the pediatric ward, her small fingers gripping the straps of her worn-out backpack, like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. The hospital was like a second home now, not by choice, but by necessity. During the day, the building was a whirlwind of movement, doctors, nurses, patients, and visitors rushing back and forth, lost in their own worries. But at night, the hospital was different. The hallways stretched long and empty, the silence creeping like an unwelcome shadow. There was something haunting about it, something that made Amira's loneliness feel heavier. She reached the waiting area near the intensive care unit, ICU, where the pediatric wing connected to the main hospital. This was her safe spot, a quiet corner where no one paid attention to a small girl curled up against the window. The city lights stretched below like a sea of tiny stars, the world moving on without her. She pulled off her backpack, setting it down carefully. Inside were her only possessions: a thin blanket, a small flashlight, a half-empty water bottle, and a medical book she had found in the hospital library. The pages were dog-eared and worn, filled with complicated words she didn't fully understand. But she was determined to learn. Her mother always told her that knowledge was the key to everything, that if she worked hard enough, she could be anything she wanted, even a doctor. Amira traced her fingers over the words on the page, whispering softly to herself. Diagnosis, treatment, recovery. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing back the burning in her chest. One day, she would understand these words. One day, she would make sure no one had to go through what her mother was going through now. Her mother, Grace Thompson, lay just a few doors away, unconscious in a hospital bed, wires and tubes keeping her alive. The image was burned into Amira's mind. The pale skin, the slow rise and fall of her chest, the machines beeping steadily as if counting down the seconds of uncertainty. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Her mother had always been strong, always there to pick her up when she fell, always making sure there was food on the table, even when she worked double shifts as a hospital janitor. She scrubbed floors and sanitized rooms, her hands cracked and rough from hours of labor, but she never complained. Not once. Until that night. Until the accident. Amira hugged her knees to her chest, trying to block out the memory. She wasn't supposed to be alone. She wasn't supposed to be sleeping in a hospital every night, sneaking around like a ghost. But she couldn't leave. She wouldn't. No one knew about her, not yet. If the hospital staff found out, they would send her away. To a shelter, to social services, to somewhere far from her mother. She couldn't risk it. She had learned how to survive. She slept in hidden corners, stole leftover food from trays outside patient rooms, and used the hospital restrooms to wash up. She moved like a shadow, careful not to draw attention. But shadows could only hide for so long. That night, as she curled up on two stacked plastic chairs, using her thin hoodie as a blanket, she didn't realize that someone was watching her. The doctor's discovery. Dr. Elijah Carter was exhausted. He rubbed his eyes, scanning the last patient file of his shift. He had spent years working in pediatrics, learning to balance hope and heartbreak. But something about tonight felt different. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her, a small figure moving cautiously near the ICU. Head down, shoulders hunched, steps silent. She wasn't just another visitor. She knew the hospital, and something about that didn't sit right with him. Dr. Elijah Carter was no stranger to exhaustion. He had spent over a decade in the medical field, yet the pediatric ward always left a particular weight on his chest. He had seen too many small faces marked with fear, too many parents clinging to fragile hope. The long hours, the constant pressure, the endless responsibility, it all became routine after a while. But some nights felt different. Tonight was one of them. He sat in his dimly lit office, his white coat slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened, staring at the last patient chart of his shift. His pen hovered over the paper, but his mind wasn't focused on the medical records in front of him. Something else gnawed at his thoughts. A shadow. A small, silent figure slipping through the hospital halls. He had first noticed her out of the corner of his eye. A little girl, her movements precise and cautious, her head down as she navigated the corridors like someone who knew the hospital too well. Not a lost visitor, not a patient's sibling waiting for news. No, this child was different. Dr. Carter frowned, setting his pen down. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 9:42 p.m. Visiting hours had ended long ago. He should have been heading home, but something about that girl unsettled him. He had seen her before. Not just once. She was always there, hovering near the intensive care unit. ICU, slipping through hallways at night, vanishing before anyone could question her presence. He had dismissed it at first, assuming she was a patient's child, someone waiting for a relative. But now that he thought about it, he had never seen her with an adult. Something wasn't right. Dr. Carter sighed, rubbing his forehead. Maybe he was overthinking. Maybe she had just been left unsupervised for too long. But his instincts, the same instincts that had saved countless young lives in the operating room, told him otherwise. Standing, he grabbed his clipboard and left his office, his shoes clicking softly against the tile floor. The hospital at night always felt different, quieter, lonelier. And somewhere in that silence, a little girl was hiding. The girl in the corner. Dr. Carter didn't have to search for long. Near the waiting area by the ICU, tucked in the shadows by a large window, he found her. The little girl was curled up on two stacked plastic chairs, her knees drawn to her chest, a tattered backpack clutched tightly in her arms. Her hoodie, too thin for the hospital's air conditioning, barely covered her small frame. The glow from the city lights outside cast a soft outline around her, making her look even smaller, more fragile. She was asleep. Dr. Carter's chest tightened. He stepped closer, his doctor's instincts taking over as he quickly assessed her condition. No IV lines, no hospital wristband, no visible injuries. She wasn't a patient. She was living here. A lump formed in his throat. How had no one noticed? How long had she been alone in this hospital, slipping through the cracks, surviving in the shadows? Dr. Carter had spent years treating children who had lost their way. Runaways, foster kids with nowhere to go, little ones left behind by a world that had forgotten them. But something about this girl felt different. She wasn't just hiding. She was waiting. But for what? For who? Dr. Carter crouched down carefully, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. Her face was soft in sleep, but her features were pinched with exhaustion, as if she had spent too many nights just like this. Cold, alone, afraid. This wasn't right. Not in his hospital. Not on his watch. He reached out gently, tapping her shoulder. "Hey, kid," he said softly. Her eyes flew open, wide with panic. She scrambled back so fast, she almost toppled off the chairs. "Whoa, easy," Dr. Carter said, raising his hands in a calming gesture. "I'm not security. I'm not going to kick you out." The girl didn't move. Her breath was shaky, her fingers curled tight around her backpack. Dr. Carter studied her reaction carefully. This wasn't just fear of being caught. This was a child who had been running for too long. "What's your name?" he asked. The girl swallowed hard. Her dark brown eyes darted to the exit, calculating, planning. She was ready to run. "Hey," Dr. Carter said, keeping his voice gentle. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I just want to know your name." A long pause. Then, barely above a whisper, "Amira." A story unfolds. Dr. Carter exhaled slowly. He finally had a name. A small piece of the puzzle. But Amira's body remained tense, her small hands gripping the fabric of her hoodie so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't trust him. Dr. Carter had spent enough time around children to recognize the kind of fear that came from experience. This wasn't just about getting caught. It was about survival. "Amira," he repeated, letting the name settle in the air. "How long have you been staying here?" No answer. She glanced toward the hallway, her breathing uneven. "Amira, I'm not going to make you leave," Dr. Carter said. "But I need to understand what's going on." She hesitated. Then, "I'm just waiting for my mom." Her voice cracked on the last word. Something inside Dr. Carter broke. His gaze flickered toward the ICU, realization dawning. "Your mother," he repeated, his voice quieter now. "She's here, isn't she?" Amira nodded slowly, blinking rapidly as if trying to keep herself from breaking down. Dr. Carter felt his stomach drop. It all made sense now. This little girl wasn't just hiding. She was holding on, desperately, fiercely, to the only thing she had left. And for the first time in a long time, Dr. Carter felt something deep in his chest. A responsibility. Not just as a doctor, but as someone who refused to let this child slip through the cracks. Tomorrow, he would find out the truth. And more importantly, he would help her, no matter what it took. A secret no longer hidden. Amira thought she had mastered the art of disappearing. But she hadn't accounted for Dr. Elijah Carter. And when he began digging deeper, what he uncovered would change everything. Forever. A hope reborn. The next morning, Dr. Carter made a silent vow as he arrived at the hospital. He wasn't just going to figure out Amira's story. He was going to change it. He spent the first few hours of his shift digging through patient records, searching for Grace Thompson, Amira's mother. When he finally found her file, his breath caught in his throat. She had been admitted 6 weeks ago after a workplace accident in the hospital's janitorial department. Head trauma, internal bleeding, coma. But one detail stood out. Grace's medical bills were piling up, unpaid. Her emergency contact was listed as deceased, meaning Amira had no one. No one but a hospital full of strangers. And yet, instead of running, instead of giving up, Amira had stayed by her mother's side, night after night, fighting the only way she knew how. Dr. Carter closed the file, his jaw tight. This child had been completely abandoned by the system. Not anymore. A new beginning. Dr. Carter found Amira sitting in her usual spot by the window, staring out at the world beyond the glass. When he sat beside her, she didn't flinch this time. She just clutched her backpack a little tighter. "I read your mother's file," he said gently. Amira's breath hitched. Is she getting worse? Dr. Carter shook his head. "She's stable. And she's strong. Just like you." Amira bit her lip, her eyes welling up. "She always told me I had to be strong." "You are," Dr. Carter said. "But you don't have to do this alone anymore." For the first time, Amira looked at him, really looked at him. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, just understanding. And maybe, just maybe, hope. The miracle, they had been waiting for. A week later, the impossible happened. Dr. Carter had been making his usual rounds when a commotion erupted from the ICU. Nurses were rushing into a room, their voices urgent yet hopeful. And then, a miracle. Grace Thompson opened her eyes. Amira had been asleep in the waiting room when Dr. Carter shook her awake, his face unreadable. "Come with me," he said. She rubbed her eyes, confused. But when they reached her mother's hospital room, her world shifted. Because lying there, awake, blinking back tears, was her mother. Amira's breath caught in her throat. Mama." Grace's weak, trembling hand lifted slightly, reaching for her daughter. "Baby?" A strangled sob burst from Amira's chest as she ran forward, throwing herself into her mother's arms. Dr. Carter turned away, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had seen thousands of medical recoveries in his career, but nothing compared to this. This wasn't just medicine. This was love, a future filled with light. Days turned into weeks, and Grace grew stronger. Dr. Carter didn't just stop at helping Amira find shelter. He personally ensured that Grace had a hospital-sponsored recovery plan, financial support, and a fresh start once she was discharged. But the real surprise came when Amira shyly approached him one evening, holding her medical book. "I want to be a doctor one day," she whispered. "Like you." Dr. Carter smiled, his chest tightening with pride. "You already have everything it takes," he said. "And when the time comes, I'll make sure you get there." Amira's eyes shone with a hope that had once been lost. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. Because she wasn't alone anymore. She never would be again. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.